Now the first thing we're going to look at has to do with the mixed material for the bump map, which creates a rather interesting effect and does work differently than other bump maps. I have loaded in the rubber plant, which is that mixed material with the influence of environment. And with the way this is set up, it does impact the bump channel differently than the other channels. And I want to show you this. The easiest way to really see what's happening is to replace the texture map for the bump. So we're going to go to the links, and I'm going to load in replace the link for the bump. And I have an image I created, which is just a simple gradient I created in Photoshop, just a circle. And this is really going to work well in order to demonstrate this. So the first thing I need to do is go into each material and increase the bump amount. Let's just bring them both up to 1. And we can see that is showing accurately in the preview, where we'd have a circular look. But something else is also happening. The bump is almost reversing itself about halfway through on some of the leaves. If you take a look at this bottom leaf here, we can see the lighting is affecting both sides. And it's not really going in or out. If we go to the atmosphere, and let's just set it to global ambience, so there's no interference with radiosity, we can still see that happening. And now it's not happening on every leaf, and you can also see that it does reverse. So even though this bump should be affected the same way on this side, on the left, this leaf, because we can see the stem shadow down here, and we know the light's coming from this direction. This bump should be lit on this side, on the right. But instead it's lit on the left, and all of these leaves on this side of the plant are lit that way. On the right side of the plant, it's lit on the other side, and that's that reverse bump I referred to in earlier parts of the training. But with the mixed material, not only do we get that reversal, but we also get some leaves that just have a mix of both. And it's not so much their orientation, it's just something that kind of happens. And it's not something that I've found to be able to control. Even switching to a world coordinate system does not correct the problem. And one of the huge issues with a world coordinate system is the impact of it when you're using wind and breeze. Because whenever you have a world coordinate material, the plant will move through the surface, which just doesn't work and isn't something that you'd be able to use effectively on a plant. So looking at this render, we can see it is partially direction oriented. The only thing is, it's not necessarily where the leaves are at render time. It's where they were when the plant is created on Eon's side, and whatever techniques they're using to create color variations and so on. And it's probably something that is more frequent within the color variation. And one way to get a better idea because a lot of plants have color variations built into them, which can be a problem when you're trying to create species. Let's take a look at one that has a very obvious color variation, which is the Excellent plant. And I've still got that wireframe. Go ahead and drop it, increase the scale, and let's take a look at the smooth shaded mode. Now, if we take a look at just the material, it's the same. There's no variation in the material itself. If we take a look at the leaf and the material, all we have is just a texture map and transparency map. The color variation itself is built in and cannot be directly modified or fine-tuned. It is a color variation that is based on a couple of things. One being the sort of embedded UV mapping of these plants, because the color variations tend to stay on plant polygon surfaces. As we can see, there's no real change on the leaves themselves. They have that color variation overall on the leaf, and it stays consistent. We can really see this if we export a plant. So let's take this species and go up to the top right and export. And I'm going to export this just as a C4D file. But what we really want is the maps, the bump map and the alpha and the color. Now the alpha is actually the transparency map. It is called an alpha map because it may be used as an alpha in other applications, but it's not necessarily the alpha that is part of the plant, because there is an alpha output, but most plants in Vue, or pretty much every plant, uses the transparency rather than the alpha output, which is why you also have settings based on white being clipped out, black being there, rather than it being an opaque amount, opacity amount, where white would be what remains. Now the texture maps of this aren't very large. I just want to double check and see for the output. If you want to see what the scale is, you can open the material and we can see that we have 545 by 1200. So really not a bad size image. So we'll adjust the mesh resolution. We're going to go ahead and select those options again and just increase our texture map scale. Let's set an amount of 1000. We could also do actual dimensions, effective resolution, a couple different settings. It doesn't really matter. So I'll just go ahead and select this export and we're going to take a look at it. And I have decided just to export as a 3DS format, just so I could open it up in Photoshop and take a look at the images a little better. I do want to note, however, that the 3DS format and export is using the wrong normal direction, so they may not show up properly. Because the back faces are what is showing up. But we can take a look at the plant, and we can see those color variations that were generated. So if we take a look at the map, what we're seeing is the color variation output. So this is probably something that's built into the plant, where you just have these colors overlaying. And at the moment, I have yet to find a way to remove that, or find the way that these UV maps are really working, just because the plants weren't designed to be edited in this way. And the only thing you could really do is to export them just like we did, and then modify the color, taking the original, which is this leaf right here, and then copying and paste it on the rest of the UV map. There are ways to get the color variation to work with you rather than against you. In a lot of cases, it does become very difficult to modify species that are using the color variations. For instance, if we take a look at this plant, modifying the overall color will create a very interesting change because of the embedded color. And normally what you can do is if you want to tone down something that's showing up, let's see, we have these almost pink red values. It might be a little too bright. If we want to get away from that, what we need to do is just reverse the color by editing the overall color and moving in the opposite direction. In this case, we would want to move a little more towards green. The only problem is, what will happen is if it's too intense, those top leaves that are already green will look a little too green and won't look right overall. So we could also use maybe a color blend. And let's go ahead and modify that color. And we can start to improve it by decreasing saturation amounts, but for the most part we don't have a direct ability to edit that variation color. So basically that is something that would be part of the ecosystem overall coloring. And let's just take a quick look at that. So we're going to select that plant stand object and actually go back, grab that ground material, paste it onto this object, reset our size, because anytime we convert over to a stacked or mixed material, making any changes, it will change the scale, so we will need to set that back. And we'll add in this excellent plant. We're going to populate, checking our environment. I also want to note, depending on how familiar you are with the environment tab, this grass texture had these environment settings sort of embedded in them. Because there was no texture underneath it, the environment tab wasn't available. Just as we selected now, we don't see the environment tab. Whenever you add another layer, those values are carried over. In the case of an ecosystem, it's transferred. So those do need to be reset, and that is part of the built-in material. So if you were to save out this grass, you would want to first create a layer and put it underneath it, where you could add a layer and just move it down below. And now if we take a look at the grass, we're going to see those settings. So now we can modify the grass and get it ready to save out if we want to have it nice and even and not affected by the environment. Delete that layer. And really quick, I'll just go ahead and delete the ecosystem layer. Add a new one. And if we take a look, we can see that those ecosystem environment settings are now those new grass settings we had. And I do want to change that scale. I do want to note that the scale of an ecosystem layer does not affect the plants, but it will affect the material underneath it. So if this is a value of 100 for the grass, we change the ecosystem material, scale to 2, it does modify, we can do 40, so it's increasing it, and multiplying it, scaling it, making it larger. And then there's the overall scale as well. So we'll just go back, add in that plant, and make sure that we have decay near foreign objects turned off, increase our density, and let's just take a look. And doing a little bit of a render. We can see that variation showing up. Now with this plan, it's not that bad, because at least the variation is consistent. All the plants basically have sort of the same variation. It's not something that will take a lot of editing to fix. I am going to increase scale and our density so we can see these plants a little better. And it does look like I have my camera placed in the wrong place. Go ahead and select it. Take a look at the pivot. It does look like I'm modified its position. So we're just going to move that down, center it where we want our main focus. Now I want to note that any ecosystem color changes we make are going to overlay on top of these colors. So it still, in a sense, has problems and can be difficult to edit a species that has a color variation, and there are several. If we look at the excellent plant, that has it, and going over the bamboo has it, Aurelia species has it, which is where the rubber plant's from, which has a slight variation on that. And it does become difficult to sort of counteract that. So if we open the material, actually we do need to get that leaf material, or actually the ecosystem. So we'll select what's called grass, because that name carried over from the previous layer. Go over to the color tab, and we can select a variable color. By default, the color map becomes the overall color. And then as we modify the color map, the overall color will change. Now, the output we see, if we edit the function, we have the color output. Now it says it works as a color or a number, but really the embedded color is this color map. Making color changes usually doesn't modify the variation. Instead, you use a number output, like a fractal or noise or image, to control the variation of the color and the change throughout the color map. So if we edit our color map, what I want to do is go down to the bottom, create a new key color. We're going to move this more towards the green. And we're going to keep that top at the current overall color. And click OK. Populate. And really what it's doing is just taking the center right now, because we don't have anything defined. This number, when nothing is defined, is 0, which is the center of the color map. In this case, a blend between the new color, the green, and the existing original overall color. So we need to set up our variation. There's a lot of different ways we can do this. We could set it up with slope. If we connect to slope, now our color is changing variation through this color map based on the slope amount. A fairly simple, basic setup. We're going to go back, and we can also reverse that. using the opposite filter. Also keeping in mind that we do need to repopulate unless you're using dynamic population. And now we're seeing a reverse effect and overall density amount. So we're going to go back, and instead of using slope, let's go ahead and use altitude. Since this is based on altitude, we can control it basically the same way. Let's do opposite. And we might need to modify, and one way we can modify the altitude is with the altitude filter. So we can go to environment sensitive, select altitude. We can adjust the influence, the minimum effect altitude, and there are other ways to soften and lighten this amount. One node that we can use the absolute, and we can take a look at it before it reaches the altitude, selecting the node, going to the bottom left, and showing graph. So now we can modify contrast and threshold. It is difficult to see exactly where these values are. If we open up the node preview, we can take a look at our extent, which is 19.9, our extension. So this is this small number here, which is going to show the maximum amount, where it just kind of dips. We can see it go down to 0. But still, overall, the amount, without a really precise control, it is difficult to modify. Now, granted, we can go beyond it, and let's go ahead and select, instead of even using any of these, let's use a fractal. We'll select the altitude, simple fractal. Let's change it to Cellular Patterns Voronoi. Increase our metascale up to 99. Click OK. And now we're going to see the variation is changing. So instead of having something that's consistent, it will now vary. So in this case, we're reversing that color blend in order to make it uneven rather than staying completely the same. Since it has so much color in it, it would be more realistic in this sense to actually have it change. So you can control that with any number. Now, when color variations become a problem, it can be a little harder to deal with. And sometimes takes modifications of the maps themselves in order to get that to work correctly. So what we can do is modify this material, and I'm going to replace the excellent, remove it, add in a plant. We're going to use the patch of grass. And we do have that color variation turned on still. So let's take a look without the color variation, or the variable color amount. So reset the function, selecting variable color, populate. Now with this current lighting I have set up, it is difficult to see. There are patches that are showing up a lot darker. We will need to modify, or I'll need to change my angle here so that we can see the variation a little better. Grasses are one of the biggest problems just because a lot of grass is basically the same color. It might have a slight variation, but not nearly as much as shown in view with the grass species. So what we have are these red patches and some lighter patches showing. Any color we modify this to, change it. If we go to select our grass material and take a look, we can see some of it is built into the color itself. If we take a look at the material for the color, we have some different setups there. Let's go ahead and go back to the ecosystem, set a variable color, and edit this to something a little more green to try to counteract that red that's showing up. We can delete that other color that we had before the end of the map. We're going to see something a little bit better, where we're going to definitely have something more green, but it may not necessarily be consistent, because it is going to be an overlay on top of the existing color. Now this definitely looks better. It still has some issues, but one of the main problems you'll run into, especially with the grass, is mainly the mixing and having large clumps of specific colors, where it should be a little more varied. Because the grass itself is the same, it looks the same, it shouldn't be so varied unless it was a different species. I mean, kind of one of the purposes of having the whole ecosystem and having different species available is the ability to really choose what you want to be in it. But instead, unfortunately, with some of the grass species, it does become difficult. I've gone ahead and reduced the width of the grass so that we got rid of those really thick blades, which is typically required because otherwise it's just completely unrealistic. And in some areas they're really bent over too much too. And so once you get to a point where you modify this to look good for its shape, then those colors become even more obvious. Now this is really dark because of the color overlay, so I'm going to increase the exposure, and you can see these brown patches, and for the most part it might be okay in some situations, but you really have no control over it, and you're not always going to see this kind of a variation in the grass you want to create. You might want a nice green lawn that is a nice even color throughout, maybe a few other species in it, but you wouldn't want to have this dramatic of color change. So what you really need to do is transition between the instances. Rather than that color change affecting everything, you need to work with it. Take a look at these colors, so we can see we're moving more towards kind of a browner area and some lighter greens, and what you can do is modify the color, and I'm going to, and it looks like I cannot export the link. Need to incorporate it first, and I can export, call it grass. We'll just do a bump map, or sorry, a bitmap image. And I'll go ahead and just close out what we're showing you before. We can open up the grass and now take a look. Now we can see some of that color variation is built in to this color map itself, but even changing this map to all be one consistent color, it's actually going to make it worse. But still, these variations don't really work well, and it's mainly about creating your own grass, because the grass that is part of this patch of grass, this color map looks awful. It has really so many issues that I wouldn't know where to begin. So I mean, you really want to be able to work on your own grass, something that's going to be acceptable, because this is just bad, and it doesn't look great either, and the grass is too thick, and obviously these white edges showing up. So it's a very, very old species, and obviously needs to be updated. Unfortunately, the other species that are available for grass just don't fill in enough area. If we take a look, some of the other species, we have some longer grasses, but those create clumps, and you need to have a nice dispersed grass. Now, I've created several grasses that work really good overall, but even then, you can sometimes run into these clumping problems, where you just have this overall color. So the best thing to really do is pretending that we have a little bit of a better image here. We would overlay colors, because the setup on this isn't that great. So let's say we wanted to create some browner patches, and we really just want to be able to transition these. And another thing is keep in mind that we have these nice wide images, and that works really well for the patch of grass. So we can create a new layer, and let's do a brush. So if you want to just quickly modify a map to slightly overlay a color, either using opacity, or you could use some of these blending modes to modify it. Sometimes it works better if you do single blades of grass, and it's really more about where these leaf maps start to overlap, and then you want to have a nice transition between the colors. Since this map itself is just so awful it needs to be changed, so it's really something to keep in mind when you're designing your own. I want to show you something really quick for a grass that I created. And there are multiple ways to create grass and get a good look for them. This is one method, to just throw it on a scanner and scan it in. It's quite effective and works really well for grass. Photographs are difficult for grass specifically just because it'd be very difficult to clip it out. I did want to make a note for those of you making your own grass that what I found worked best to create and extract the color to create the transparency or alpha map was to take a piece of red construction paper and then place that behind the grass. This seemed to be the color that worked better than any of the others I tried to be able to remove any sort of blending between the two colors, because what will happen is if you're using just the white standard background, most scanners have the top, it's white, it'll show up. If you leave it off, it turns black. But with the white, what would happen is you're going to see that green because there's so much light, and the grass itself is translucent. That light will shine through and show up. And what you're going to end up with is these edges of green transitioning into the white. That can make it really difficult to extract a transparency. And like I said, the red really worked well. I also found that pressing a book down onto the paper, and rather than using the lid, pressing down on it kept the shadows down, because those shadows become really problematic. So the more you can remove them, the better, but also try and keep as much depth as possible. Now, this wouldn't be a final map. You would want to use pieces of it. And what I did was ended up using 3 variations of it so that I got a nice horizontal image. And I'll just show you one of the finished maps. So this is the color map. It's a combination of a couple of different scans, and although the paper and back is green, this was created after the transparency map was generated. What I did was modify that color to blend it to green, and this is one of the stages. What I also did was removed a lot of the shadows in another version, more the final version of it. But it's really important that you don't have that red background left, because with MIP mapping and resampling of images as you're moving through your scenery, what can happen with the rescaling and resampling is it can pull out some of those colors, especially if you have a little bit of an inaccurate transparency map. Now this is a modified transparency map where I cut off the tips to make it more of an even type grass. This is also a very large file, so while I'm recording it's a little sluggish. But as you can see, it's not perfect. It does have some spots that would need to be corrected for extreme close-ups, which this is completely capable of. But it looks really good, and it blended well and came out of the image pretty good. So I just overlay that, and extracting that red was really easy. If you're not really familiar with how to do something like that, it was mainly using image adjustments and then replace color, making the red white and making the green black. And then after that, it was really a matter of just adjusting the levels, maybe using a threshold filter. So that way having that separation of color makes it really, really easy. The black and white filter was also extremely useful. So you can go to image adjustments and black and white. So if we open back up that red image, I am going to rotate, and I can just show you. I am going to go ahead and scale this down just because I still have view running, and this is a huge image. So we'll change our, actually we'll go ahead and use bicubic, because I don't want any really sharp areas to show up. Okay, so this will work a little bit better. And I'm going to go to, well, there's 2 different ways we can do it. And really the best thing to do is create a duplicate of the layer and use a combination, because once the color's gone, there's nothing you can really do. So you want to make sure you can run the process separately on the main image, and then you can use the 2 in combination with each other. So first there's the black and white. We can take our reds, and we're going to make them white, take our greens, and turn them more towards black. Same thing would be with the yellows. And now your shadows are going to end up being a slightly different color, if there's any shadows showing up on the image. For the most part, that's a good starting point. We can now adjust levels. We could clip out all of that in-between area so that we have something that's just almost a direct black and white. And now we have a useful clip map. It would need to be modified slightly, but even that, just the black and white filter works pretty well. You can also use the threshold to refine it and refine the edges a little more, and using maybe the reduced noise filter, but never falling below 5 with something like this because it would blur your edges. If we go back to the other mode, if we need to fine tune it, we can go to Adjustments, Replace Color. We're going to select that red. And now you can see that the different tones of red will show up pretty much as a different type of gradient throughout the image. We can adjust the fuzziness amount, which is the blend. And you can use localized color clusters. I suggest turning that off for this method, just because some of the red will show through onto some of the green slightly, and that might not turn out to be the best. So what we want to do is increase the lightness. And now we've got a white background. We can do a replace color again of the green, making it black. And we would need to adjust levels. And now a combination between the two different maps will help take care of any of the areas we see that can be difficult to tell which is which. And obviously this isn't really grayscale yet, so we would change it to black and white. So we can see we have two different versions, so the edges appear differently. And that way we can either use the eraser tool, blend them, really figure out which ones we want to use. If we want, we could just darken or lighten if one map has certain areas the other one doesn't. But like I was saying, it's a good starting point. And if you need to go in and fine-tune, you can easily do that. And then to change that color back, I'll just go back to when we change the image size within the history. Go to Adjustments, Replace Color, and then for creating our color map, we would just want to modify that. And our result would be the color of the grass at the slightly decreased saturation. And you can see, as I start to move this away, how the red is slightly affecting the edges of the grass. So you will need to increase the fuzziness all the way. And now we have the color map. And because this is a nice smooth image, for the most part, with our highlights, we can actually generate a really nice bump map out of it too. And we would pretty much derive all that information from the map anyway, but because there is a nice bit of geometry or depth from the different layers of grass, it does work out pretty well. So what I can do is go to black and white. And we can make adjustments. We do want to pay attention to those edges, depending on how the clip is going to remove certain areas. And then using the reduced noise and surface blur works really well. We'd also want to convert this to a 16-bit grayscale. Adjust levels to give us some nice variation. Change the output so there's really no harsh black in it. Go back, adjust levels again. And then let's just run a quick surface blur, even though we're just doing this 8-bit. And that will take care of some of the bad artifacts that will show up. Reduce noise once again. So we can generate some pretty good bump maps and highlight maps from this. Because of the way I sampled this, it's creating these very jagged lines. That's part of the reduced noise and also the sampling, those combination together. So technically the image size sampling that I used, where I used the bicubic, bilinear might work better, or even bicubic sharper possibly. So you might want to just give it a try and see what's going to work best. I could have just had these values too high as well.